When I thought about this morning, I decided I would be a little personal in the beginning, then talk a little bit about the sort of arts in my world at MIT, and then a little bit about where it's going. And the personal part isn't really to talk about me as much as to maybe put some of the attitudes in context. When I was in first grade, I didn't think my first grade teacher was doing a good job. So what I did is I made an appointment with the headmaster. I got the appointment. I sat in the office waiting with a few other people. My feet didn't even hit the ground. I got my appointment. I explained to the headmaster, Mr. Hubble, why I thought the first grade teacher wasn't very good, and he thanked me. And that was the beginning of my academic career. I sort of behaved like that for the rest of my life. And sort of in keeping with that, I did school half in the United States, half in Europe. And before coming to MIT, my last 2 years were at an American prep school in Connecticut, where they did sports. They played football, I thought sports was too stupid to participate in. So what do? I went to the headmaster, and I said to the headmaster, you know, I want to do art during all the sports periods. And he said, wow, nobody's ever suggested that. Of course you can. And so I did no sports, and every afternoon, when everybody else was doing this stupid stuff, or at least what I thought was pretty stupid, I was in the art studio doing art. So that was kind of phase 2 of kind of going to the headmaster and sort of trying to get the rules changed. Then I went back to the same person, slightly longer story. I had always done well. I'd won all the art prizes there were to win, in whether it was primary school, middle school, high school. But I made a mistake of getting an 800 on my SAT, my math exam. And I didn't quite know what to do. And MIT had given me early acceptance, probably because of the 800. And I went to the same headmaster and I said, you know, I do well seemingly in math, and I've always loved art. What I should do is go study architecture. And he said something so profound, it went right over my head. He said, I think he called me Nicky. I was at the stage of life where people called me Nicky. He said, Nicky, I like gray suits, and I like pinstriped suits, but I don't like gray pinstriped suits. Whew, that went right over me, and I even found a pinstriped suit this morning, and I thought I'd wear the pinstriped suit. I went to architecture school, and I came to MIT, and it took me about 3 years to realize that architecture for me was, if you will, a gray pinstriped suit, but computers were the intersection of art and mathematics and technology. So when I came as a freshman in 1961, most people in this room weren't born. President Kennedy was the president. It was an extraordinary year for me because coming to MIT was quite extraordinary, and meeting Yuri Kepish, who became my advisor and my professor. And for those of you who don't know, he was sort of the last surviving Bauhaus sort of figure. He had been brought to MIT in 1948 from Chicago, where he was with Moholy-Nagy before Moholy-Nagy died. He came here partly because Gropius was at Harvard, and he was a professor in the School of Architecture and Planning and did many great things, which I won't accept. I viewed it as an influence. I found in a person somebody who really understood at least what I thought was the future. And then I caught a bug. And the bug was computer programming. I learned how to computer program pretty early on and loved doing it so much. I worked on a program here, excuse this terrible slide, But this slide was a display. Now we're talking 1963, 64. And this, just the concept of displays were pretty. And this was a computer program that routed automobiles from a given point to another given point, and you typed the coordinates in. There were 1,000 automobiles in the system, and it would go to the pickup point and drop you at the destination. The acronym was CARS, stood for Computer Aided Routing System, and welcome to Uber. 63, 64. And so I just couldn't get over it. I couldn't program enough. And Moshe Safdie steps into the world. Now, Moshe Safdie is not only alive today, he's actually very young, because unlike architects, he was 23, 24 at the time. I was 18 or 19, whatever. And he had done Habitat for the World's Fair in Montreal in '67. And that project completely changed at least the MIT Department of Architecture. I was working on my thesis and so on. And we were all rushing out to buy sugar cubes to build our models. And all the models were little mini habitats. And of course, then when I went to sort of what am I going to do after graduating, I figured, well, instead of trying to be an architect, why not build the tools for architects? You'd have a bigger influence. Maybe your ego isn't satisfied quite the same way, but if you could make the tools that the architects use, that would have a bigger, more global impact. And guess what? I build a system that does habitats. And this is, again, old, very old technology, very, back here on campus and just across the street at Tech Square that had just been built. And it became, again, more of an obsession than anything else. I just couldn't stop writing computer programs and doing this sort of stuff until we got invited to do something at the Jewish Museum in New York for an exhibit called Software. And here we just went nuts, because we decided as the display, what we would do is we would have a robot build a habitat, basically, with these blocks. And you can sort of imagine the gantry moving and building a little sort of world of blocks. And it was inhabited by gerbils. And you can see a few in the foreground. And the gerbils were put in the box during the show. And as the gerbils ran around and moved the blocks, if the block was just slightly ajar, the program would straighten it. If it was substantially ajar, get this, it was assumed to be purposeful. And so the robot would put it in the new place, but sort of straightened out. So if you went back to the exhibit, you would see a sort of mini habitat that was changing, because it was changing. There were enough purposeful events over the full day. Well, there are a couple of things that happen. One is gerbils get tired, okay? So that it'll only work for about an hour. And the other is, so we had teams of gerbils. We had teams that would come out, an A, B, C, and D team. And it was, again, it was my first experience doing something computational, relatively technical, in the context of a museum where the viewer, if the viewer couldn't understand it, it could be called art. And whether it was art, whether it was not art, actually didn't matter. So as we went forward, building our little group in the architecture department, Phil mentioned, we did things like invent touch-sensitive displays, decided that we would try and build rooms that were computers, that you would live in the computer. And it was, again, for its day, it had a floor-to-ceiling display shown, I think, in the next slide, barely. A floor-to-ceiling display in 1973, we're now at 73, 74, was unheard of, because the way you made a floor-to-ceiling display is by taking a piece of glass that is rear projection glass, and a 12-foot piece of glass has to come on a special truck, and then having a huge projector in the back which in the days cost $250,000 to project that particular image. And it was funded by the Department of Defense as very advanced human-computer interface, but it allowed us to, again, look at the world through interface design until I meet this guy. Now, coincidences play roles that you look back on life and you say to yourself, wow, wasn't that something? It turns out that the president's office at MIT was more or less in a direct line with my lab if he wanted to go to his chauffeur, Mr. Tibbs. I don't know if other presidents have had chauffeurs, but Mr. Tibbs was his full-time chauffeur parked at the bottom of the elevator where my lab was at the top. And as you can guess from just a couple of pictures I've shown, it was a very photogenic lab. I mean, it had rooms like you saw. You could go in, you could wear the stuff, sit down. The chair became interactive. So what did Jerry do? Most days before lunch, maybe 3 times a week, he would walk through the lab with these really interesting people. And once the president's done that 20 times, 40 times, 60 times, 100 times, you kind of get to know each other. And he told me something. And there are 2 separate stories here. So think of this as story A. He said, Nicholas, I am going to retire as president, but I am not going to become chairman. Because Howard Johnson, who was then the chairman, was actually younger and doing pretty good stuff. He said, I don't want to displace Howard. I want to go back and work in a lab. But there's no lab. There's no lab for me to work in. And I said, Jerry, I'll build you a lab. And that's basically what happened. Now, something else happened, which is maybe not story B yet, but it's just a coincidence. In the Department of Architecture, it was the recipient, if you will, or the holding entity for the arts activities at MIT, which were not just Kepish's Center for Advanced Visual Studies, which was getting going, but Minor White was doing photography. You had, even though computer music wasn't in our department, it was in our degree program, and you had computer animation, you had graphic design. And those groups had students. What degree would the students get? And how could you attract the students at undergraduate or graduate level? And so I became accidentally, because I'm not good at this stuff or particularly like academic administration, I became the head of department for all the peripheral people, if you will. Ran the degree program. And we became literally a salon des refusés. When we decided to build the Media Lab, a few people, I have them here, very active. Ricky Leacock was the filmmaker running the film video program, had come to MIT. Jerry Wiesner brought him here in, I think it was 68, 69, partly because of the unrest on campus. Seymour Papert, who recently died, was a mathematician, had worked with Piaget, and he was in a group that no longer exists. And I went to see the then provost. Talk about having provosts under your belt. I've had them all. And I went to see this provost, and I said, you know, I want to include Seymour Papert in this new Media Lab. And he said, bless your heart. Just wanted to get rid of these people. Marvin Minsky was pretty disaffected by the AI lab. He wanted to get out. I said, Marvin, join us. So Marvin, Seymour, Ricky, and then one more, Muriel. Muriel was at the MIT Press and is most identified with that. It was a piece of her work. So those were the founding people. And the Salon des Refusés aspect of it was very important, partly because while we were doing research, call it the more technical side, we were printing money. And MIT is not going to disrupt the golden goose while you're making golden eggs. So you could be the Salon des Refusés, you could do this crazy stuff as long as you were self-supporting, and we were. But when we decided to build the lab, MIT said something very appropriate. They said, if you and Jerry Wiesner are going to do this, which took raising, I think it was $40 million, which I used to think of as a lot of money, but $40 million, don't go back to our donors. Don't go back to old friends. Don't go to Texas Instruments. Don't go to, the people who have been supporting us. Make new friends. Well, new friends came from 3 places. And God, we spent a lot of time in those 3 places. Hollywood. Nobody at MIT had ever gone to Hollywood. There isn't a movie studio that didn't fund the Media Lab. I could tell you stories. The only actually funny story was that I arranged to have breakfast with Robert Redford to get 20th Century Fox to fund us. And what he does at breakfast is he gets Jerry Wiesner to fund him for $1 million from the MacArthur Foundation. I said, wow, Jerry, that breakfast just turned out exactly the upside down. We were supposed to get money from them, not you give him. At any rate, Hollywood was one. Personal computers, by definition, was one, because it didn't exist before. So Steve Jobs was very active. He participated, and in fact, he gave us $500,000 when he could ill afford it. Actually a paper check, I remember taking it. And the third was Japan. Japan was important because when Jerry Wiesner was President Kennedy's science advisor, President Kennedy had sent him to Japan to help the Japanese rebuild their industries. Well, flash forward 20 years, and we're back there. Guess what? The people who Jerry talked to were suddenly the CEOs and the chairmen of those companies. So, boom, that was the third group, and that put us into business. We built the building. Tell you hundreds of stories about the building. And the thesis was, and I suspect while people may not say it the same way, it's that the creative users are the inventors. Full stop. If you look at the history of photography, by and large, it was invented by photographers. Somebody wanted faster speed, somebody wanted color, somebody wanted motion. Television was the exact opposite. Television was invented by engineers who then threw it over the wall and told people to use it. My comment to Jerry and to the corporation is that computers will be like photography, and that the creative users in the future are going to invent it. That's the entire thesis of the lab. And at the time, the medium is not the message, which was kind of wild because the medium is the message. God was getting an awful lot of attention and was on people's lips, though they didn't really think about what does it mean to be digital. And bits are bits. The medium is not the message. Okay, the message is the message because it's actually embodied in some representation that then can be put on a screen or then be put out in sound or whatever. You can't experience bits. Bits are not experienceable. They have no size, shape, color, et cetera, et cetera. So the misfits come along. Now we're in business. We're hiring faculty, and we start finding people around the world who, and I could pick many people. I decided I'll just pick 4 Japanese. And the first one was this young man who was working at NTT, and they were so embarrassed by his work, they more or less put him in a closet. And the first time I went to visit, they said, oh, no, you don't want to go down there. You don't want to see that. Next time I said, hey, I actually do. And when I met Hiroshi Ishii, I said, Hiroshi, come out of the closet. Come to MIT. And he did, and he's had a good 20-plus year history. John Maeda studied electrical engineering at MIT. He was in the PhD program, and he hated his 6'7" Germanic heel-clicking advisor who was telling him to do this, this, and this. And I said, John, drop out. He did. His parents could have killed me because they'd worked their whole life for John to go to college, and here I am advising him to drop out. He drops out. He goes to Japan because he hadn't been to, I mean, his parents are both Japanese, but he was born here. He finds his identity in Japan. He gets a PhD in Japan, and then sadly, Muriel Cooper, whom I showed you earlier, dies. Very young, unexpected. And we hire replacement faculty to do a massive search, and John Maeda comes up and comes back and joins the faculty. So it took about 10 years for the parents to love me again, and he came as a faculty member and did a wonderful job until he went on to be the president of RISD. This is newer news. Sputniko joined us quite recently from the Royal College of Art, but had done her master's work at Imperial College, and Neri is really sort of what this whole meeting's about, and I don't know if she's participating, but I'm sure her work will be cited. Now, why did the Media Lab succeed? Now, you can judge whether it succeeded. I'm not trying to say, you know, look, it succeeded. It didn't succeed because of me. It succeeded because of a little twist of fate that I don't know if I was just on my feet or Jerry Wiesner or Howard Johnson. Howard Johnson was the chairman of the board of MIT. And I think it's fair to say that most people on the board, many faculty, thought Jerry Wiesner was wasting his time with Nicholas Negroponte. And that even worse, it was an opportunity cost because Jerry could raise money, he could sell the Eskimo icebergs. That he was just such a good fundraiser. Isn't it a shame he's not doing it for something else? Well, as it got a little bit of momentum, and as Phil and Marty and others in the MIT administration, while you might not say it the way I'm going to say it, MIT really has two, so think of it as two axes. One are the academic departments, and the others are the labs. And I'm being a little simplistic, but let me call them church and state. The academic departments admit the students, award the degrees, hire the faculty, bring up the tenure cases, and so on and so forth. And in rough terms, the labs have contracts and money and space and hire, pay for RAs and do the sort of that kind of stuff. And I said to Howard at the time, I said, you know, I think it would be really good if we were both a lab and an academic department. Not as a power play, but because we wanted to admit students who had strong arts backgrounds who would have never gotten into MIT. We wanted to hire faculty who were doing things that, again, weren't part of it. Also, what self-respecting artist at the time would apply or think they could get it? So we felt we really had to have that church and state license, and it worked. I think it worked quite successfully because of that one fluke. And you have to correct me if I'm wrong, it never happened before, and I don't think it's happened since. That doesn't mean it's not happened because people hate it. And then, as Phil mentioned, we did a search about 6 years ago. We were doing a search for a new director for the Media Lab, and one of the rules at MIT, and I think it happens a lot of places, you can't be on the search of your successor. You can't be on the search committee. And so I wasn't on my immediate successor, but he had the good judgment to leave after 5 years, and I could be on the search committee of his successor, which is why Phil and I and a few others. And this name pops up, Joey Ito. Now, the search committee started in September, maybe even late August, and somebody says around the table, I don't believe I'm being revisionist, but you can correct me, says, does anybody in the room know Joey Ito? Because his name had come up, and I said, yes, I do, I know him. And Joey Ito hadn't graduated from college. He was a dropout in Chicago. He was a dropout at Tufts. He was a disc jockey each time he was a dropout. Went off to Japan, was quite well-known and successful in the internet world of Japan. And they said, look, if you know him, could you please send him an email thanking him for applying, but telling him in some kind way that he doesn't qualify. So I write Joey a note. I say, Joey, thank you for applying. I forget exactly how I phrased it. It said, but you're really pushing the limits. You don't qualify. You don't even have an undergraduate degree. This just isn't possible. And look forward to seeing you wherever we meet next. September, October, November, December, January, February, March. In March, this committee comes up empty. And the committee looks at itself and says, why don't we revisit the people who turned us down and whom we turned down? Because sometimes people turn you down because it's a two-body problem and the husband doesn't want to move or the weather or some reasons that you maybe could go back and push on. And then we could relook at the ones that we didn't consider. And boop, Joey's name pops up again. I forget if people forgot or just, pushing on it. They say, well, who knows him? I know him. Could you send him an email and ask him if he's interested? And I sent him 3 words. Where are you? And I got an instant answer in 1 word, Bahamas. And then I said something like, get your ass up to MIT tomorrow, or something like that. He was here 2 days later. He walked in, as far as I'm concerned, probably filled too. He got the job. It was just such a perfect thing. Then one has to market it and sell it and push it through the administration. And I have to tell you, insofar as the Media Lab's my baby, giving it to him, this is really a wonderful, wonderful change. So in the 2 minutes that are left, where are we headed in the future? And I have 2 slides, this and one more. If I have to say a buzzword, biotech is the new digital. It'll happen in many places, not just going to happen at the Media Lab. It's going to happen. MIT is very much a place for that sort of thing to happen. And why is it happening? It's happening because of Feynman. At least his paper was the first one I read, that as we get smaller and smaller, and this is the zinger. This is something that you got to sleep on. Just reading it is, I grew up with the working assumption, and I'll use an old-fashioned politically incorrect term, the man-made world and the natural world were orthogonal, and that good architecture, for example, was the skill and art of putting things in nature in such a way that enhanced nature or that didn't disrupt it or maybe provided things that weren't there before, et cetera. You can imagine that there would be the symbiosis of this artificial world and this natural world, and suddenly going forward, from sort of this point on, they're the same. They're not different. And suddenly, we can actually not just be informed by nature, we can actually do things, and in some cases, better than nature. So it's a very complex, think about it, and there's so many ramifications, but that's, in my opinion, is what's going to govern the next decade of thought at places like the Media Lab, and I think in places like MIT, is that world is coming together. So with that, Mark, thank you very much. I will be around. Thank you.